See, this is what I do. Hello, and welcome back to the Food Engineering e-magazine podcast. Today, I'm with the fabulous Christie Lagally, CEO and founder of Rebellious Foods, a plant-based protein company that emphasizes the importance of clean manufacturing and maintaining a healthy planet. And I also heard that she's a space engineer. Today, we are celebrating women in manufacturing, and I'm honored to be speaking with such an outstanding woman. Christy, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm doing great. It's a lot of fun to be here.
Awesome. So, I would like you to introduce yourself a little bit more. I'm sure you can do a much better job than I can.
Sure. My name is Christie Lagally. I'm the founder and CEO of Rebellious Foods. Rebellious Foods is a food production and production technology company working to make plant-based meat available and affordable for everyone.
So, are you yourself a vegetarian or vegan, or do you just enjoy plant-based meats?
Yeah. So I actually am a vegan. I've been a vegan for 27 years. So I have a long history of veganism within in my life. But I was not always in the food industry. I spent most of my career in the aerospace industry, developing tools and doing design work for spacecraft, aircraft, and ground-based telescopes, including at one point working on the James Webb Space Telescope as well as the 30-meter telescope. So I got to have a lot of fun working on a wide variety of really interesting projects that impact a couple of different industries like that. But like a lot of people, we want to address the major issues in our society, like climate change, human health, and animal welfare. I felt like I could do that personally as a vegan, someone who, people who care about the environment often want to eat less meat or not eat meat. I also care about animals, and so I decided to become a vegan because I care deeply about the welfare of animals. And then also, I decided to get into the food industry and start working on the issue of plant-based meat because I saw a unique opportunity where the production of plant-based meat was really holding back the industry. And that's, of course, what we do at Rebellious Foods. We're designing and deploying novel production equipment that makes plant-based meat faster, better, and cheaper. In fact, so cheap that we can actually meet or beat the price of chicken products.
That is so exciting to hear because also as a vegetarian and partial vegan, it is really ridiculous how the prices have increased exponentially since the clean foods and the movement to, plant-based has become now like in my generation huge. Like I have friends who are older than me telling me that when they were, a vegetarian or vegan around my age, it was very difficult to find things that tasted good. Tofu has always been around, but
Yeah, it turns out there's a long history of veganism and vegetarianism in nearly every country in the world, in nearly every religion and every culture, because I think there's always people in every society who care about these issues. Now, unfortunately, modern day life has brought those issues to the forefront because climate change is such an urgent matter. So I applaud you for being vegetarian and vegan because these are really good and really impactful ways that we can make a difference in our personal climate change impact.
absolutely. Even just a couple days a week, being like
Yeah,
a weekend
absolutely.
vegetarian does a lot more than you think it might. And I think that producing things like chicken nuggets, chicken patties, things like that can be easily accessible. Not something that like people aren't familiar with and is just kind of replacing like your Friday dinner. Those things make it really accessible to people who are not vegan or vegetarian or comfortable with it, even from the beginning, to try something new and see if it has a place in their life, in their family life. I got immensely excited looking at your website, and I am just so glad to hear, someone in the food industry. I know it's talked about a lot with carbon emissions, but not explicitly climate change and how food is something that is impacting it, and then how to, negate that or lessen the impacts through manufacturing. And I think that's a really interesting thing about Rebellious Foods is that it's not just, okay, so we're making a vegan chicken nugget. We're also really, really worried, and we really, really want to make sure that the technology we're developing can be used to help negate the effects of climate change and hopefully reverse them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the reasons that replacing meat, particularly meat on a large scale, makes such a big difference is that the industrial animal agriculture is one of the largest emitters of methane. And methane is a far more potent, meaning it's a far more detrimental greenhouse gas than even CO2. In fact, some reference it to be 25 or even 30 times the greenhouse gas warming impact of just CO2. So it can be very, very impactful to reduce the emissions from industrial animal agriculture because it reduces the emissions of methane. And so where we can make a really big impact is by replacing those, large scale products such as chicken. We actually can, what we're doing is we're actually replacing the methane emissions that truly make the impact in climate change. Now, obviously, we're doing other things as well. In the case of replacing chicken, we're replacing the antibiotics used in the chicken industry so that, school kids aren't being exposed to residues of antibiotics. We're replacing the cholesterol and high levels of saturated fat in a lot of our processed chicken products so that we're eating healthier foods when we're eating plant-based. So there's a lot of other residual and all side benefits beyond just climate change. But what people don't realize, and what we work on at Rebellious Food, but what people don't realize is that in the United States alone, we produce over 108 billion pounds of animal-based meat. That's just in the US alone. 50 billion of that, 50, which is roughly half the total volume of meat, is just chicken alone. And if you compare that to the amount of plant-based meat we produce in the United States, it's actually plant-based meat clocks in at just 0.5% of that volume. So we're talking about 700 million to maybe a billion pounds of plant-based meat versus over 108 billion pounds of animal-based meat. And that's why Rebellious Foods has been hyper focusing on large scale production equipment that brings down the costs, increases the volume, and maintains that high quality of a custom product, but made at a scale and a price that can be affordable in, say, our public schools or in large scale cafeterias. And that's where we're going to really see moving the needle on climate change and human health when people can afford the products, they love the products, and those products are doing exactly what they would normally do for their lunchtime chicken sandwich.
A side note here, I don't know if you've seen David Attenborough's witness statement documentary that he has made.
I have not. Should I see that?
Oh man, yes, it made me cry. My partner and I were trying to watch like cute animal documentaries, and then we came
Uh-huh.
across that, and it was like him and I are both vegetarians, but man, it hit hard. The impact
Mm.
of just meat in itself, and that part of the his witness statement to climate change. It was very impactful.
Yeah.
but
Just the
any, yeah, but
Yeah, the
anyway,
scale of it is pretty
yeah.
intense, isn't it? I mean, in the United States, like I said, 108 billion pounds of animal-based meat. But in terms of individual animals, we kill more chickens on this planet than any other animal that even comes into existence. 9
Essentially, yeah,
billion.
he said that the growth of the meat industry is not sustainable even within the next 10 years. There will not be enough
Unfortunately.
land space to
Mhm.
have the amount of animal farms, even like factory farming, like that will never be enough. It will never satisfy the need, and therefore we need to have alternatives, and alternatives that can then go back into ensuring that the soil that is used to grow those plants are going to be sustained. It's going to be reusable. It's not going to harm the environment or the landscape at all. I just thought that that's what came to my mind instantly were those numbers.
Mhm.
And I know that's not something that a lot of like some people aren't super concerned about it. I do feel like the food industry is very aware of it, which is why it's now going into cell-based 3D printed meat, which I
Mhm.
love talking to my friends about because they're like, "Wow, that's so weird." And I'm like, "Well, that's the future."
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is a a wide range of alternatives to meat that we're seeing that we've have had for a long time, but also are going to have more of in the future. But unfortunately, the time is now. Like
Hmm.
we do not have more than just, roughly about 8 years to really address the largest impacts of climate change without seeing catastrophic effects going forward within yours and my lifetime, and not in just that, within the decade. And so as a result, I strongly believe in cultured meat. I strongly believe in alternatives to meat, mushroom-based meat. But the reason that we do what we do at Rebellious is to hit the scale. We're designing new production equipment because we know that it's not enough to feed a couple 10,000 people or 20,000 people. We need to produce on the order of the meat industry, tens of billions of pounds of plant-based meat. And that's truly what we're doing at Rebellious, is setting up the future for large-scale plant-based meat production, which, by the way, can easily be converted to making finished goods, even with cultured meat ingredients.
I feel like you and I could probably talk about this for hours. But I do want to start talking about your journey specifically
Sure.
into the food engineering world. It sounds like a huge part of it came from your personal passions and your lifestyle choices. And what I want to know is because it seems like um, space engineering, the aerospace technology industry is possibly more male dominated than the food manufacturing industry. And for you to switch industries, into just two very male dominated industries, I want to ask, like, how, what was your experience in general? And then can you describe some people that you saw as mentors that helped you
Yeah.
along the way?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked it that way, because there were a lot of people that I saw as mentors and who were mentors, and people I never got to meet that I would consider mentors. So I'd love to share that with you. Yeah, I started my career as a mechanical engineer in the aerospace industry. My first project was actually working on a deployable spacecraft, including an early project on the James Webb Space Telescope, which was recently launched all of these years later. So that was really excited. I worked on one of NASA's solar sails. I worked on a variety of early experimental projects for solar concentrators in space. So I had a really good time working on those early projects. I went on to expand my repertoire of engineering projects by working on ground-based telescopes and even on roller coasters at one point, for a company up in Vancouver. I had a grand old time working on the 30-meter telescope project, as well as some of the roller coaster rides that they were doing with deployable robots and things like that, which was a ton of fun. I then went on to work for Boeing Commercial Airplanes, which ended up being quite a solid home for me, and I will always remember it fondly. I loved working at Boeing Commercial Airplanes. I got to work on research and development for new tools to build the wings faster, better, and cheaper. So I got a ton of experience designing new tools, patenting equipment, figuring out how to deploy tools when we were able to do that, understanding how it had to fit within the manufacturing environment, because everybody knows that is quite literally the hardest problem out there, is just getting it onto a production floor and getting it operational, because it is super fun to design equipment and come up with new automations and things like that, but integrating it with the people and the processes of manufacturing is, well, let's just say deployment is 90% of the game. And so So, I had a really good time doing that at Boeing Commercial Airplanes. I even briefly got to work in noise engineering, doing a little bit of flight testing. So that was really fun too. Came back to research and development, and got to work on the 777 for a while, 777X for a while. But ultimately, what kept drawing my heart away from aerospace industry was this issue of climate change, human health, and animal welfare. I saw so many people in my family who had issues with not being able to kind of change their diet appreciably, or so many people that in like schools and hospitals where it was like they just didn't have access to plant-based food. Or, what I remember, I will never forget, I was at my desk at Boeing one day when, there was a major report that came out of, I think it was one of the climate conferences that basically said we had 12 years to address the worst impacts of climate change or else. And I remember that was 6 years ago now. So we are literally on the precipice of where we have to really make some drastic changes. And so I decided that, if understanding the major problems in the production of plant-based meat, it came down to the fact that we literally had never industrialized it. We have never created new automated equipment for production of plant-based meat. We have so many great recipes and ingredients and things like that, but we had never addressed the boots on the ground manufacturing problem of plant-based meat, which is actually the one of the biggest costs of plant-based meat. It's what keeps it so costly. It also is what makes the quality so variable when we try to make it at scale. And so that's what we set out to do at Rebellious 5 years ago in 2 months. We said we are going to solve the manufacturing problem of plant-based meat. And over the course of those 5 years, we've developed a novel production system that reduces the cost of making that plant-based meat dough down to just under the price of processed chicken products. So now we're in the process of getting the first large-scale commercial deployment of that system, and that's what we're doing in 2023.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's so exciting.
Thank you.
So, who really were, like, can you describe, like, maybe the two main people that helped you get into the food engineering industry? I'm sure it
Yes.
wasn't too hard considering your background in aerospace engineering. I'm sure someone in the food industry would be like, oh, yes, get her on my team right now. That would be great.
Thank you. Well, I kind of jumped in 2 feet. I briefly worked between Boeing and Seattle Food Tech and Rebellious Foods, which Seattle Food Tech is our corporate name. Rebellious Foods is our brand name. But I briefly worked for the Good Food Institute. At that point, I actually met a couple of other people in the food industry, like Gaurash Ganjal, who is the chair of the Department of Food Science at Washington State University. He was a huge influence in helping me understand, what are the major problems with making plant-based meat and why is it so expensive? Also, Atsid Jan Vandergoot at Wageningen University. Had the luxury of getting to visit his lab out in the Netherlands, and he was also an inspiration to me to really dive into this issue of food manufacturing and food structuring. Really brought it forward for me of how much we really hadn't solved this problem. And maybe a lot of researchers had come up with one idea or the other, but when you compare that to the massive scale of growing houses, processing facilities, and literally slaughterhouses and finished goods processing in literally every county of every state in the United States, and then of course worldwide beyond that, we're talking about a minuscule change at the laboratory scale that really needs to be brought out to the world. And so, despite all of the emphasis in the plant-based meat space about products and novel ingredients and things like that, we ignored all that and focused specifically on automated production equipment that was solving the fundamental problems. So it was really those two people who really that kind of taught me about the industry and inspired me. Also, one of our advisors, Mansoor Samadapur at IEH Laboratories. He's one of our advisors. He also was an inspiration to me to really look at a lot of the issues and also to understand the food safety issues that the industry was going to see upon scale up. And that's another thing that we drove hard and are still driving hard to solve, because by changing the production system from what was now kind of a rudimentary batch-based method to a continuous process, automated methodology of handling ingredients, handling dough, handling hydration, we can actually improve food safety, dramatically improve quality, dramatically lower the price, and make it much more accessible and affordable for everyone.
So, what kind of obstacles have you ever had any pushback when starting Rebellious Foods? When you jumped 2 feet first into this, was there any pushback or obstacles
Yeah.
that you faced?
Yeah, I would say the number one thing that we faced, and that I faced at, in starting Rebellious, was just a complete lack of understanding in the venture world about what it means to develop manufacturing tools. So anybody who works in food engineering or food manufacturing knows that they tend to be kind of behind the scenes. What food production workers are dealing with by having to work in a refrigerated warehouse to produce meat. What boots on the ground engineering team leaders are having to do just to keep breading and frying machines up and running. These are all things that they don't get a whole lot of credit for it, right? They don't, people in food manufacturing, it's almost just like a given. Oh, that'll just happen, or
Yeah.
we'll send it to a co-man and it's not going to be that big of a deal. And yeah, maybe they'll charge us a lot, but that's just politics or something. When in fact, that's just not the truth. It is hard to make plant-based meat. It takes more equipment than it is to make animal-based meat. It takes 3 times the labor, 3 times the time, and you end up having to do so much more to get it right, and it's much more sensitive to mistakes, that if you can't get it right, then the food manufacturer ends up absorbing that cost. And
Right.
so I think the major roadblock was trying to convince investors, as well as people who just needed to come on board and come help us, that this was the problem with food, with the production of plant-based meat. This was the barrier that we were seeing in the world, why people can't get affordable, high quality, low cost plant-based meat at a reasonable volume that can, say, serve their school district. Because this was what was missing from the puzzle, was the ability to actually produce products in an automated, continuous, high quality fashion, and do it at volumes that are actually going to be meaningful to a larger market. And so I think that was probably the biggest thing. And, having it come from the voice of a woman, we spend less than 2% of all venture capital actually goes into women founded and women operated companies. So that's a serious impediment as well. But in the end, we probably raised 1/6 or 1/7 the amount of money as comparable plant-based meat companies, but we sure did a heck of a lot with it. 5 years later, we did a lot more with that money, and we still have a lot of the money, and we've got plenty of runway, and we're continuing onward to our final mission, which is price parity in 2023.
I love that this, like you said, background technology that serves such it is the bones of the whole manufacturing, the whole industry is this equipment. And automation is something that is now, I mean, you can't avoid it. It is essential to avoid labor shortages, crises, weather disruptions, all sorts of things. And we cover it a lot in our magazine of ways to avoid it. And more than anything, it has automation involved in it. Now, most of that is for, specific like type, specific sub industries, right, within the food engineering. Myself, since I've been on the magazine, I have not heard a lot about automation within the alternative plant based protein sector of the industry. So I think it's really important what you're doing because it's not really in the media, although it should be, right?
Yeah.
It absolutely should be. And as you said, coming from a voice of a woman, I can only imagine what it would be like to try to get the investors to listen to you, knowing how big of a task this is and how important it is, um, and not really understanding what it really means to be able to have that technology.
Yeah, and if you've never been a production worker on a production floor at a 40-degree chilled warehouse, slicing up chickens, you probably don't really know how bad it can be for people who are experiencing that. Chicken processing is now one if sometimes the largest contributor to in workplace injury in the United States, surpassing even coal mining just a few years ago. And workers are really at the forefront of bringing foods to our table in these food production facilities. Our job as part of our transition to an alternative protein future is also to transition the job of the worker so that he or she are working in a facility that is not going to be detrimental to their health. Now, one way to do that is to take the animals out of the process because they can spread disease. They require a chilled warehouse. They, obviously put a huge mental load on the people having to slaughter them, and not to mention that the animals go through. But by transitioning chicken processing facilities to plant-based meat production facilities, which is what we can also do with our equipment, we will be able to give workers a better environment and have better jobs to be producing high volume, high quality plant-based meat versus what they were doing when they were having to process and deal with all the negative aspects of processing chicken.
That's something I haven't even thought of really how it is for workers working in those facilities. I know I absolutely do not have the stomach for it, but I also know friends who have moms with chickens on their lawn, on their farms, and they do processing them themselves, and I also couldn't imagine that. On a larger scale, it it sounds like it could be something that could be a positive influence on the labor shortage in the manufacturing industry, which is really the where it's hitting the hardest, right? I mean, manufacturing workers, processing workers, those are the sectors that are getting hit very hard.
Mm.
Um, so we don't have a whole lot of time left. I've been loving this conversation. Um, but I want to ask you
Oops.
something that is really hard to answer. At least I think I would be would be a little um, nervous to answer this one. But what advice would you give to your former self and women who are just beginning their careers in food?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is, do your best to find your allies, other people who really know the reasons why you're there, like food production workers or people advocating for, workers in the food industry. Know your allies in every sector of where you're trying to make change, particularly. In my case, there we have allies in the climate change advocacy realm. We have allies in animal welfare and animal protection. We have allies in human health. And, Rebellious is a big supplier to the USDA National School Lunch Program. And so we have allies there too. So I highly recommend, connecting with those people, not trying to necessarily push through kind of the popularity game of venture capital and trying to be kind of like the charismatic leader that maybe we see in like WeWork founders or something like that. Long-term research on really impactful, sustainable companies shows that, keeping to your mission, hyper focusing on success, and, really getting work done and doing it with your allies is what really makes a sustainable company impactful in the world. So I highly recommend that. Also makes you feel a lot less lonely when you're trying to really make change in an industry. And so I recommend that. It is also great to find other women in food manufacturing so that we can really band together where we can and work together. And that's really important.
Yeah, so I did hear that you have an all-female leadership team at
We do.
Rebellious Foods,
That's right.
which I was very excited to hear about. And I want to know if that was on purpose or it just so happened that the people that you had in place for those positions were just really well qualified women.
Yeah, definitely very qualified women, and I think that women sometimes want to work for other women, and so we end up with it being more effective, where to have some women in leadership, and then in the end, it just ended up all being women. We hire for the right person for the right job. But we are about 60 or so percent women in the company. We're about 20 people right now, but we have amazing people, men and women, all dedicated to our mission, all dedicated to the effort of bringing low cost, pardon me, low cost, high quality plant-based chicken to all the school kids and, cafeterias across the country. And of course to, Whole Foods and Kroger and all sorts of other retail outlets where you can buy our products. But we're all dedicated to that. And we come from many different diverse backgrounds, multiple different countries. And I think that that's a really testament to the fact that there are people in every culture and in every part of the world who want to make a difference. And I'm glad that, at least 20 of us could do it at Rebellious Foods.
So diversity must be something that you are pretty passionate about in your leadership. Diversity must be something that you're really passionate about within the leadership strategy that you have at Rebellious Foods.
Mhm. Yeah, diversity, comes in many different forms. Obviously, people often think of either, gender diversity or racial diversity or things like that, which are super important to us at Rebellious. And, the great thing about that is when you hire the right person for the job that's high qualified and they want to be there and want to get stuff done, you kind of end up with good diversity. At least we're getting there. There's always room for improvement, and I think there's always room for more opportunity to figure out the best ways to do that. But what else I love about diversity is that it really does show, as I already mentioned, that people from all walks of life, all countries, all cultures within the United States love animals, care about climate change, want to make a difference. And I think that when that shows up in a plant-based or alt meat company, it's a true reflection of the force of good that is out there in the world wanting to make change. So if we don't have that diversity, if it's not reflecting that, we're not reflecting the people we intend to serve. And like I said, we can always do better at Rebellious, and I really hope we will do better in the future. But diversity is really a fundamental of being able to serve the larger community with alternatives to meat. And that really does start with the people who are building the change we want to see in the world.
That is such a beautiful testament. I thank you so much for that answer. I am so excited to see where Rebellious is in 5 years from now. I also have been scouring my Kroger and Meyer to try to find some food, some of your guys' chicken products or meat chicken products. I might have to order online, but I'm excited to try it, and I'm going to make a point to.
Great.
Christy, thank you so much for being on this podcast. I think that your words are going to impact a lot of women who are listening to this and anyone listening to this who have that passion for diversity, who want to think about ways that they can make their facility more innovative, advanced, and to be part of the solution to climate change.
Thank you, Samantha. It was an honor to be here. I really appreciate you having me.
Of course. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to Food Engineering Podcast. My name is Samantha Russo, Managing Editor of Food Engineering, and this is Christie Lagally, CEO and founder of Rebellious Foods. See you next time.